fellow tent pros. Welcome to episode 5 of the Pitching Tents podcast, brought to you by Top Tech Event Tents. I'm your host, Bryan Bolt, and
this is Davis West.
What's happening, Davis? Everything good?
Yeah, I'm glad to be home.
Davis just got off a week on the road. I'm doing the same next week, so
we've been wearing the road
getting
down.
It typical spring, right?
Yeah,
it's
everybody's busy though. Well, I say everybody's busy. Everybody's kicking it into gear.
Yeah,
that's the census I got this week was we are rocking and rolling now.
It's go time.
So yeah, it's good for everybody.
Totally, it's been a busy spring here for sure, and glad to see everybody kind of getting back to it. Everybody's kind of finished their maintenance and gotten everything up to go. Now it's time to put it into gear.
Yeah, it's always funny this time of year. Everybody's tired of washing chairs and refinishing tables and everything else. They're like, we just want to get out now at this point.
That's right.
I remember those days. I used to hate washing chairs.
Enough's enough after a while. Let's go.
Yeah. Let's sling some tents.
Yep. It's been a busy, like I said, busy spring for us so far. I've been quoting a lot of custom work so far. I don't know if there's any particular reason for that, but we enjoy doing custom projects. It kind of taxes your capability a little bit.
I'd rather do a custom project personally because it's like, hey, look what we can do.
That's right.
That's
right. They're pretty rewarding, but they are certainly
time consuming
and intensive.
Yep.
Like I said, Davis just got off the road for a little while. I'll be doing that next week.
Where are you headed?
I'm headed to the great state of Texas.
Oh, Texas.
Yep. Davis was up in kind of the mid-Atlantic this week.
Got up to D.C. That's the first time I've ever gone downtown Washington. That was
that's good to see.
Pretty interesting.
Stuff there everybody needs to see for sure.
Yeah.
So let's talk about what we're going to talk about today is we're going to get into frame tents. And specifically, what is a frame tent? We did, the last episode was with Pete, well received, got a lot of great reviews on that.
That was a high listen there.
It was. Today we're gonna talk about pretty basic frame tents. What are they? What's the general definition? What constitutes a frame tent? And then we're gonna get into all the different styles, and specifically we'll talk about we have some specific products at Top Tech that not necessarily other people have and aren't compatible with other systems. So we're gonna talk about a little bit of that and a bunch more. So let's just jump right in. The general definition of a frame tent is a frame tent versus a pole tent. And I always tell people that you can pretty well separate any tents, regardless of style, in either one of two categories. They're either frame tent or a pole tent. Certainly last episode, we talked about pole tents and kind of what they are. Today, with the frame tents, we're going to talk specifically. Frame tents are, by definition, they have a framework under them that supports the vinyl, tops, sidewalls. Pretty simple, elementary in design. The most popular would be what is commonly referred to as a West Coast frame.
Yeah.
And everybody...
I feel like everybody
I shouldn't say everybody, because we had this conversation before about starting at 201 versus 101. And I had a friend of mine tell me that he listened to the podcast, and he goes, you forget, he said, some of us know nothing, and we're listening to this, so...
Oh, we talk about that every year at tent school, too. It's like you start at zero, and even our zero is not zeroed down enough.
We're stepping in right in the middle and don't necessarily realize it. So that's what we wanted to do with the whole design for this podcast. And the reason for us doing this is to bring people from zero all the way up through.
It's educational based.
Let's say that again.
It's educational based. That's
for
what
sure.
our goal is.
Yeah. So we don't realize what people don't know. So let's talk about very elemental level. And so generally speaking, again, a frame tent is going to be, it's got some sort of framework underneath it that supports the vinyl. So we always say stakes hold a frame tent down, stakes hold a pole tent up, because you have to put outside tension on a pole tent just for it to maintain its shape. That's not the case with a frame, because that frame's doing the work.
Yeah, the frame is independent of itself.
Correct. Now, those can look a lot of different ways, right? Because of different styles, engineering and designs that are out there on different frame tents. But again, back to the most elementary, basic level frame tent has been what is commonly referred to as a West Coast frame. It was told to me way back when that these were originally started and originated on the West Coast. Therefore, what the name was.
Where the name came from.
So they, by definition, they use a 2-inch diameter aluminum tubing that's an 1/8 wall or 125 wall thickness. That's the most common, most prevalent extrusion of aluminum that's used in the tent industry. There's just a lot of those. Now, because of that and that extrusion, it's just a basic round profile. It's 2 inches diameter. you can only do so much with it, right?
Correct.
So here at Top Tech, we will only go to a 30 wide using that extrusion. Our opinion is, and there are plenty of frames out there that we've seen over time. Our opinion is the 40 wide 2-inch frame has no place really in the market, especially on a rental, because we have this conversation with customers all the time that somebody that's got a 2-inch West Coast frame 40 wide, they can quickly offset the expense of a larger ketered frame, which is, we're not getting into keters today, so I don't want to go down that path, but they could quickly offset that by the labor savings, because considerable labor savings in a larger keter frame because of what you can do. You can span greater distance. That's the bigger point here, is that you can span greater distances with other extrusions.
Tops, etc. You're not dragging tops and stuff like that over the frame with that.
Correct. And what Davis is talking about there too is these West Coast frames, let's say it's a 20 or 30 wide for purposes of conversation. Those frames are put together, roof framework on the ground, then you take the top, and the tops are sectional, meaning they can expand in length. Tents are controlled by width, so a 20 wide top is not going to be a 30 wide top.
Correct.
But you can add length to that by adding, typically in the case of a West Coast frame, 10 or 20 foot increments.
Right.
And expand that in length. No big deal. But in order to do that, you're either going to take those tops while they're off the frame, off the side, lots of ground cover. That's another big consideration with those frame tents. Put those tops together off the frame while the roof framework is built on the ground. Drag those tops up and over the frame after they're assembled. So you could have, let's say, a 30 by 60. You're fighting that entire roof cloth or vinyl up and over the framework.
I do want to jump in here on this West Coast thing, though, because it's kind of phasing out of the market now, because you do have these hybrid style systems that it's the same kind of frame, just with now you're allowing ketered tops into it. And the expansion of that is a whole lot easier, not only on your tops, but as well as on your labor side of it. West Coast, I see it phasing out more and more, but you're still going to have that hybrid style version of the West Coast.
Yeah, there are always going to be people who are price sensitive, and so that's the thing about the West Coast frames, is you've seen more intrusion from the Asian suppliers, let's say, and from offshore suppliers into that, because I always say they're cheap in every way. They're cheaply made. They don't have any real bracing in those tents. I've seen occasionally you'll see somebody add a cable or something to try to help stiffen that, but what you're trying to do is overcome what a 2-inch frame can't do.
And even those cables that I've seen, they're like head height clearance. They're pretty low. They go
they'll run, let's say you're on a 7 or 8 foot leg, then all you're doing is putting a straight cable across the width of that tent. So at every junction or intermediate, you're going to have a straight cable at 7 or 8 foot elevation straight across the width of the tent.
Right. And that's
so there's other things that happen in some other tents to get around that. But back to the point about these West Coast frames, they are very, very basic in design. They typically don't have much bracing in them. That's just one further way that people can lower cost. So yeah, you can get into that tent less expensively, if that's a word, but you're going to spend that in the difference in labor, because there are more advanced systems that can do what that tent can't do.
Correct.
It's just the way that it is.
And the way those are pieced together, they use R pins on those, correct? Like quick pins?
Correct. Yeah. Yep. And it's just they're steel brackets,
drop
inch and a quarter schedule 40 steel brackets in 2-inch diameter tubing. I want to go back for a second. So let's talk about the pros of frame tents over pole tents.
Okay.
Right? Number one thing is they typically have, or they will have a smaller footprint.
Correct.
So let's say you got a 30 by 60, just staying with easy.
30 by 60 what? Pole or frame?
Pole.
Okay.
You got to have let's say you got 8 foot side poles and you got 6 foot stake line.
Correct.
Right? So a 30 by 60 is now 42 by 72.
Correct.
That's the actual footprint you need. But a 30 by 60 frame tent can relatively fit in a 30 by 60 spot, because you don't necessarily have to have, depending on how you anchor it.
Right.
There are certain frames that give you provisions for adding stakes through base plates, etc. But it can fit in a tighter footprint, because you don't necessarily have to have that outward stake line.
Because it's not the stake line on the pole tent, like you said, is holding that tent up. So it does have to exceed a certain width outside of the tent. Whereas on the frame tents, it's an independent system, and the frame is holding that tent together.
Yep.
And you can put the ballast right there beside the leg.
Which leads me to my second point, is that tent can be ballasted.
Correct.
And it comes up on occasion where somebody says, can I ballast a pole tent? Yeah, I mean, the answer is yes. Yes, you can. The amount of weight that you need is more than most of us can fathom.
I was about to say, it's almost undetermined, isn't it?
What's that?
It's almost undetermined for the force needed.
Yeah, I mean, you could essentially calculate it. You need to know what material you're on, like what's your substrate. You're on asphalt, concrete. Are there any kind of modifiers, rubber mats, or plywood, or any of that kind of stuff? The amount, like if it's a typical 30 by 60 job, then now you're talking about having a ridiculous amount of weight that you got to put on it, and somebody's got to pay to get that weight to the job site.
Correct.
So a lot of times that blows budgets out of the water.
Right. Another thing, it's when it comes to rigging points on a frame tent, there's so many more points of contact that you can hang.
Yeah, you kind of limited on the pole tent.
You are to basically the center pole.
Yep, right. Yep. I've seen some creative things done to kind of lace lines and that kind of stuff, but I mean, it's as a general rule, you've got so many more points that you can figure out a way to.
We used to run cable from center pole to rig things up on a pole tent, and whereas you have your ridge pole on the pole tent or on the frame tent, so you can actually anchor stuff.
Yeah, and these days everybody's trying to do more and more with tents,
lights, draping, lighting, everything,
fans, draping, all that stuff. Right. So, tell me about somewhere a frame tent doesn't necessarily do what a pole tent can do.
In terms of the pole tent versus the frame tent, I don't think that the frame tent has as much of a dramatic look that a pole tent gives you.
Yeah, you don't get the high peak look.
Right. And to me, these smaller frame tents scream festival.
Yep.
Whereas your pole tent to me screams nice wedding event, large corporate event.
Yep.
Stuff like that. Whereas when you talk about these smaller 2-inch pole tent or frame tents, they're more of like an accessory to the main tent.
Yep.
And a lot of times the caterer's tent, back house tent, somewhere where the prep works gets done for the main event, which is under the larger tent. And in terms of that, the dramatics of the pole tent, I think, are unmatched, especially the different styles between your Epic, your Expo, and then now our Nantucket, which is our sailcloth version. You get dramatic sweeps in each of those that are different and amongst themselves.
Right. So let's talk about styles of tents, generally speaking. West Coast frame, let's jump right straight into that. West Coast frame, by definition, is a 2-inch diameter aluminum tubing, 1/8 wall, or 0.125 of an inch wall. Most common extrusion used in the tent industry, just bar none. They're widely available from a lot of different manufacturers. We're a little bit different because we don't do as I call it, a down and dirty, just a West Coast frame tent.
The closest thing we have is our Future Light, which is 2-inch round, which is a hybrid.
It's
style.
A 2-inch. It's still based on, even our Future Track is still loosely based on a 2-inch round.
Correct.
It's 1.25 schedule 40 steel brackets.
Drop-in pins.
Yeah, you got it's just a pin together system using quick pins, which are widely prevalent in the tent industry. But again, it's the most popular extrusion, but also, for that reason, there's been a lot of intrusion into those. They're supplied from a lot of offshore sources, Asian sources, et cetera. So you can get a lot of...
It's mainly imported stuff.
A lot of imported. There are certainly stateside manufacturers that make that, but the design of that tent doesn't have a lot of bracing in it, and that's one way to just control cost, really. So they just can't stand the type of weather that a comparable... bigger extrusion can handle.
Yeah, and bracing. And like you said, the West Coast it's as bad as it sounds, it is cheap in every way.
Yeah, right. And I've seen people add cables, et cetera, to them to try to help stiffen that frame and give it a chance.
Right. And I mean, you definitely see it down the ridge, too. So if you're ever just riding down, you see a longer West Coast 2-inch style frame up, you're probably going to see that ridge with a little bit of a saddle in it going down.
Right.
Because there's not that extra bracing, because there's not that extra cable that's going to cinch those rafters up and give it that backbone all the way down the ridge line.
Yep. One thing about those West Coast frames they are expandable in length. So you can typically in 10 or 20 foot increments. Most of those, you're going to find those in 10 foot sections. Certainly your 30 wide's a little different because you've got 15-foot sections in a hip end, right? But then typically your mids, you're going to find those in 10 and 20-foot increments. But
And when you talk about those tops in the 10 and 20 foot increments, those typically will what, looping grommet together or clasps together?
There's different connection styles. I've seen multiple ways. Usually they'll be like, we call it looping grommet, lace and grommet, call it what you want. That or a T-clasp is another kind of mechanical fastener that we've used with good success. But I've also seen those with just plastic 1-inch side release buckles where those sections clip together. It's just a way to control cost and get it, try to find ways.
Well, it eliminates the keter and it just gives you a quick, like a simple, cost-effective connection point.
Yeah, manufacturers are doing that as a way to take the cost and labor out of how they build the tops to transfer those savings, hopefully, to the customer. But then they have some sort of a rain flap over that connection. They're going to either be some sort of a hook with a D-ring or it's going to be Velcro. Those are typically the two we've seen.
And even when we're talking about pole and frame tents, and especially this West Coast style frame, when you're talking about looping grommet, they often looping grommet the same way a pole tent does.
Correct. Yep. And it's a strong, tried and true connection.
I mean, it's proven its point time after time, year after year.
Yeah.
But like you said, it is a cheaper way to connect tops to one another down the length of a frame tent.
Yeah. And, that 2-inch frame can be converted to keter.
Correct.
We've done some of that over time where somebody says, I've had enough of fighting these tops, dragging these tops over the frame. That's one thing that we didn't really talk about is you got to take these tops, put them together off the frame, drag them up and over the roof framework before you ever put it up on legs.
That's a lot of abrasion on your tops.
It is. It wears tops out faster and it's more labor intensive to do that way.
100%.
So those top sections aren't always compatible between. We were talking about how they connect. That was the other point is that they're not necessarily compatible from manufacturer to manufacturer. There's not a real necessarily standard.
Right.
So just because you've got a West Coast frame top from one manufacturer and you're in a jam, let's say, and you got to have some mids, that doesn't necessarily mean that they're automatically just going to connect to what you own.
Correct. Now, while we're on the West Coast style, talk me through if somebody came to you and said, look, Bryan, I have a ton of 2-inch Schedule 40 poles that are from my West Coast style frame, and I'm wanting to get into keter, say 30 wide. How could you convert somebody's West Coast style frame into our future light, for example?
Well, I usually say it's a base plate to base plate equation normally. So
right.
In other words, you're best to do it as a full arch assembly with the legs, and that way you can add keter legs for that matter. And
Correct.
Then that gets you new brackets at the intermediates, crown clusters, bracing, etc. But you'd be able to think about the width as that's what you're converting, but down the length, all that stuff is using poles that you
Correct.
already own.
Yeah, down, your 10, 15, 20-foot poles down the length of it, and you're on the perimeter and on the ridge.
They pin right in.
Yeah.
And you can
quick conversion, and then you get keter tops, and now you're rocking and rolling into a keter frame.
Correct. Yep. So
probably the easiest transition into keter, to be honest. If you have a bunch of 2-inch West Coast style stuff, that is your gateway into at least 15, 20, and 30 wide future light.
And I was going to say we stopped that at 30.
What's the reason for that?
Because there's not the profile of that extrusion can't handle spanning greater distances.
Mm-hmm.
So you're not going to get a tent with nearly the wind rating in that extrusion. The only way you can get some sort of a wind load really in that extrusion is to shorten the length of the pipe, right? You get less deflection on the pipe. So that's why you end up seeing so much with 10-foot pieces.
Correct.
Yeah, it's lighter. But now you got all these other pieces to deal with.
That's right.
Again, I don't want this to turn into a keter conversation, but we've certainly talked people through. We've certainly talked people through over the years about looking at the long-term labor exposure of putting up those more labor-intensive tents over and over and over. And I always tell people it costs you more every time you put your hands on that tent versus buying it one time.
Yep.
And dealing with that on the front end.
Exactly.
So let's talk. We've got a couple options, different options here. You can see we do again up to 20 wide, 20 by 40 in what we call our standard frame deluxe. That was a tent that really Top Tech was founded on in 1986. It's an 1 3/4 inch, not a 2-inch diameter. And it's 0.65 versus a 125 wall, so it's half the wall thickness. But it's a cold drawn tubing, meaning they pull that through a die after it's extruded. It's extruded once, allowed to cool, then they pull that through a sizing die, and it strengthens that because it's cold worked,
right,
as they call it.
And when we came out with that was mainly designed as like an over-the-counter kind of
completely designed. That's a different world back then than where we are now. And
100%.
I talk to customers all the time. They're like, I ain't no way I'm letting a customer take a 20x40 and put it up themselves.
Too much liability now.
Yeah. So that tent actually has instructions sewn to the bag, meaning that tent is pretty well confined at when it's in its packaged form. You got a top bag, a bracket bag, and a pole bag, meaning those poles break down into 58-inch sections and that go into a bag. You roll it up, and you can literally send somebody away in a minivan, pickup truck.
You could do it in a Honda Accord, man.
I've seen smaller.
Yeah.
And send them away with a tent that's got instructions sewn to the bag and say,
read the instructions.
Yeah, read the instructions. Good luck with your 20x40 for your weekend.
Call me if you can't figure it out. I'll send somebody out there and charge you for it. And those connections, too, since we were talking about the West Coast using the R pins or J pins or quick pins, whatever people call them, this kind of connection is with a push button.
That's right. There's snap buttons, push buttons, whatever you want to call it, that are captive into the pole. And then the pole, unlike the West Coast frame where the bracket goes into the pole, this one's a little different. The poles go into the brackets.
That's right.
So the push button is captive to the pole. You insert it into the bracket, and that snap button snaps into place into your brackets. And we build those that's an aluminum bracket, the way we build that. A powder-coated aluminum bracket versus a steel bracket. So it's a lighter weight frame in every way, but it's also made to be very portable. So for somebody that's early in business that doesn't necessarily have a fleet of bigger trucks, and they're working out of pickup trucks or trailers, you can take multiple of these tents, very small footprint in the requirement of a vehicle to move that around.
Well, and even in terms of installation, if you are putting up large festivals, etc., it's so easy to drive your truck around and drop that whole entire tent in its bag in its entirety right here and just run down a line and say, here's 15 20x20s already staged and ready for you to put them up.
And you've seen that in the festival work, and you're just literally working out of the back of the truck and dropping those tents down the street, and you got another crew working behind you
putting them up.
Yep.
And it works like an assembly line.
That's right.
Something else to mention about those standard frames is the legs. The legs are telescopic in those.
Yeah, they come with and the good thing about those is when you're at the base leg height is 7 feet, and we got an adjustable base that'll take you to 8, actually to 9.5 on the larger base. But even just the basic 7-foot leg is still 2-piece, and it's collapsible. So, and you've put up a lot more of those
Thousands
in your
of
exposure or your time with event rentals.
It's so nice to be able to have that tent completely up on its legs.
And it's only about 4 feet tall at that point, right?
And you can work around and go ahead and tighten it down without having to get up on a ladder.
Yeah, so let's talk about the vinyl on those. Those are one-piece tops, meaning that they have a buckle band or a bunch of buckles around the perimeter. So that vinyl is held to the framework by those straps
that go
attached to the perimeter. There's no other tension applied to the vinyl on the top other than what you put around the perimeter.
That's right.
Those are one-piece tops, meaning if you buy that tent as a 20x40, that's all it's ever going to be. You could put an expandable type or a West Coast frame top on that tent if you wanted to. So if you already own those, you can have the portability of the smaller frame and still use those West Coast tops if you need to.
Right. And vice versa. You can use our standard frame tops on a West Coast style frame.
Yeah, right. They're all basically 18-degree pitch, I think it is. So very compatible that way. And we've had people do that where they're not necessarily impressed by the quality of the vinyl that they're getting from another supplier, but they're invested in that framework. Then you can put our tops on that frame.
I mean, I have quite a few customers that in the past they've had nothing but 2-inch framework, and they have a lot of West Coast style framework. And they still use it because the metal's still good, but they just buy my standard frame tops to put on top of it.
Right. And on those frame tops, we also take, in the corners, we kind of sew down on the corner a little bit, and we put some reinforced webbing and stuff because that's just a natural wear point on these frame tents.
Yep.
And we do that to help stiffen that corner. So that's where you'll get a little different in the quality of workmanship on our tops that you won't necessarily see from everybody else.
Yeah, it's just that added little touch that, has worked over the past years that has shown to actually help those tops stay in better shape over time. Because these kind of tops, they're getting used daily.
In a lot of cases, right?
I mean, there's many times in my past work with putting up tents that I'd go take 4 or 5 of these down and take them across town and put them right back up.
Yep.
So, I mean, you're turning these extremely fast.
Correct. So let's move into, we talked about standard frame. Let's move into another frame tent that we offer that's also available up to a 20 by 40, which is the same as the Express in terms of product offering.
Frame.
10 by 10 through 20 by 40 is our Express frame.
Yep.
So the biggest difference on it, well, there's two big differences. It's 2-inch versus that 1.75" tubing. It's 2-inch diameter tubing, but it's that same thinner 065 wall. It's an extruded tubing. It's been our most popular small frame tent because, hence the name Express. It's small, light, fast, and easy to set up.
Right.
Still push button frame.
Still push button frame. Another main difference in that and our standard frame is these poles are one piece.
Yep.
The Express frame does not break down into portability.
Mm-hmm.
So your longest pole on something like that is going to be like 14.4.
Yeah, the hip pole on a 20 wide is 14.4.
Yep. You got to think about that in terms of your transfer from job site to job site.
Yeah, you
will
have
to have either a trailer or a truck that can handle transfer of essentially 15-foot poles.
Yep. Like I said, it's lightweight, highly durable.
Yep.
People think that this, just because it's lightweight, maybe it can't handle. We had a situation years ago where the ATA was IFAI at the time, and I remember we had a 15 by 15 set up in Clearwater, Florida, and people that may listen to this that were at that event, you'll remember there was a nasty storm that came through, and I remember standing inside, looking around the corner, and watching our 15 by 15 Express ride out 50-plus mile-an-hour winds that we got that day.
Yeah.
It was rocking and rolling and moving and shaking, but it rode it out.
It stood.
Yep. So
there's been plenty of examples like that. Another thing on these, the legs, as a standard, they come at 7 foot with a black plug in the bottom.
Just a plastic plug.
Yep. But you can put 30-inch and 60-inch bases in there. So if you did have a tent that was on higher legs than 8 foot, you could bring that eave of the Express to the eve of whatever.
Yeah, it goes up. Well, the 60-inch base will go up to, I think it's 9.5 feet, which is essentially the same as a 10-foot eave on a bigger tent.
Correct.
The one thing I'll point out, too, on those Express and standard frame is the fact that those tops and frames are compatible back and forth. In other words, you can put a standard frame top on an Express frame and a Express top on a standard frame.
Which I have a lot of people that do that as well. They like the fact, for one, the Express frame is cheaper than our standard frame.
Yep.
Reason for that is there's less parts that go into it, less labor, et cetera, because they are one-piece poles. So a lot of our customers that are bigger customers that have these big box trucks, et cetera, and can transfer these, they like the Express poles and they like the way the frame goes together, but they like the standard frame tops look better because they can match it with a scallop valance or a straight valance, whereas the Express frame comes standard with catenary valance.
Yep. And so when Davis is saying the catenary valance too, so you can take, the Express frame only attaches at the leg locations.
Correct.
Right? So there's no buckle band. There's no buckle band around the perimeter. It's just a tension strap that goes right down the leg. Some people call it a quick top.
Which a lot of people like because it is, from a labor standpoint, there is less buckles and less manual labor to do.
We have it on occasion where somebody will also say, I like the portability of the standard frame. I'm willing to pay a little bit more for that framework, but I like the quick top of the Express. So they'll put an Express top on a standard frame.
Yep.
It's funny too. We call it a standard frame. A lot of people think that's just West Coast frame because there's so many of those. Right. Our 1.75" breakdown frame is called the Standard Frame Deluxe. Right. So back to the point, we always say we spend half our day trying to make sure we know what somebody's actually asking for.
Exactly.
Right?
Yeah.
Again, that Express is fast to install, minimal labor. There is also a high peak option, so we can the crown clusters. What's that?
For the Express, yeah.
In the Express, yeah. So there's a high peak option. The way the crown clusters are made, you put a high peak rod in the top of the crown cluster. Now, though, you can get a high peak top for the Express that looks much like the high peak tents. We'll talk about those in a minute. But
and like you said, like if you already have the 20 by 40 and you want to make it into a high peak, the only thing you have to get for that is the rods for the high peak.
3 rods and a different top, and you got it.
Yeah. So essentially, you have two tents in one right there with just the addition of 3 components.
The crown clusters are built the same in both.
Correct.
The crown clusters in the Express are built so they can handle both. I didn't say that right. So there's no compatibility between the standard frame and the Express. Let's make sure I made that point.
100%.
All right. So let's move on to the high peak tents that everybody talks about.
These are super popular.
One of the biggest reasons they're popular is they are inherently fast and easy to install.
Correct.
Minimal parts. And there are different design takes. I've seen people use a double barrel type pole to try to help stiffen up those perimeters, a twin tube type design. I've seen people use different versions of a round profile. Like ours is 2-inch schedule 40, which is 2 3/8 OD, about a 1/4-inch wall thickness. But then if you look at some of the other people that are out there, one of the most common is a 2.5-inch tubing, and it's thinner wall. So it's a little bit bigger diameter than the Sierra that we have, but it's a thinner wall. These tents don't like hard driving rain historically. There's only so much tension you could put on the perimeter of this style tent because the way that they go together is you have a framework that's, let's say, the way they're installed is you have a perimeter framework that's laying on the ground. You have 2 cables that go from corner to corner.
And then there's one another.
What's that?
They cross one another to make an X.
So, So the center pole sits where those cables intersect.
Correct.
And that carries the top. But you only put in the case of a 2020 or even a 1515, you only have legs at the corner. So you got 4 legs. So there's only 4 points of attachment to tension that top. So nothing really happens over the middle span. Now, this would be a good opportunity, especially since we got the bully pulpit and don't have to necessarily argue anybody about this. We've had people say, for instance, we got rid of our middle buckle on the top for that tent. People say, you need to put the middle buckle back. Well, first of all, we tightened up one of the panels on that tent, and I have not gotten one complaint about water ponding on this tent literally in years now.
Just because we shortened up that panel.
Yeah, we tightened it up and we got rid of that buckle. So the question is, and we've had people say, you need to put the buckle back. Well, the thing is, when you have that buckle attached to the perimeter, now that top is captive to the perimeter. And that's where if those tents fail, it's in the middle of that span, let's say a 20 by 20. So in the middle of that 20-foot span is typically where it's going to bend that perimeter pole.
And that's where that's where your splice is too. So that's one of the weaker points there in the center of that tent. So if you put a strap around that, you're just basically driving the force right to where the weak point is in the tent.
If it starts to pond water there, it's taking the pole with it.
Absolutely.
It can't slide independent. So our point was you leave that off. And again, we haven't had the first complaint about water ponding in literally years.
And it takes 4 straps that you have to do. So
correct.
I don't know why,
So then we also offered a couple of years back an upgrade on this, which is using our Future Track, which is widely popular, extrusion. And in the case of 10 by 10, 15, 15, 20, 20, those tents can use, and we now offer the 20 by 40 in that framework, thanks to you. That was
directly in the Future Track stuff. That was...
So you got, let's say on a 10 by 10, you're using your, what we call 112 poles. And a lot of y'all know they're 9'4" perimeter poles. You can use those in the perimeter. You already own those. You can use your ketered legs. Most people already own those. This was an easy conversion for so many of our customers that already had our Future Track system. 1515 is going to use a 172 pole or a 14'4". Right? Same legs.
Yep.
20 wides are going to use the 232 or the 19'4" poles. So anyway, you can see the easy conversion. So somebody who already has a lot of that framework can easily get into that for a top, a center pole, 2 cables, and 4 corner brackets, and that's it.
Yep.
So you essentially get into for about half the price. Of a full frame.
And I got to give a shout out because BJ at Crisp Event Rentals, he drove that 2040 down my throat. Like, hey, I want this thing now.
Yeah. But
that's what we did. It was an easy conversion because he already had all the 20-foot poles.
Correct.
So, I mean, it was just, what was it? We got him 4 corners, 4 cables, and 2 intermediate brackets, and that was it.
Yep.
In the top.
Yep. And then, that tent's a little different. You could pin those perimeters because they allow for it, but really still the whole tent is still held together by the compression. The weight of the top sitting on those cables is basically holding the whole thing together.
Correct.
The question has always been, well, is that a frame tent or is that a pole tent? It's still a frame tent. The frame is holding that top up. It's got
it's just a suspension system frame tent.
Yeah, it's got that look of a pole tent, but it's truly a frame tent.
And just to be clear, though, I do want to be clear about the structural integrity of a high peak is nowhere near as sound as a conventional frame.
Yeah, there's typically fewer parts, fewer places to outguy, stabilize that frame, etc. So there's just, people love them because they are so fast.
They are.
You know, I've been to events before through the tent industry where people are literally racing, putting those things together. And I've seen 2 guys do that tent in 15 minutes.
Oh, easily.
You know?
I mean, once you get in a zone and you're just working down the line, time disappears.
Yep. So that's the long and short of frame tents, generally speaking. We have certainly Keeter tents that we offer too that are truly frame tents, but that's a topic for another episode.
That's the one I'm looking most forward to. We're going to get in the weeds there.
Well, it's going to be multiples too, because we can't possibly cover it all in one. So,
but in terms of your everyday quick, hey, we're going to throw up like 4 or 5 tents here, 4 or 5 tents here. You're mainly going to be working somewhere in this list of product.
Yeah, right. And then, certain people have that pole tent look they want, but otherwise these smaller frame tents are the workhorses of the tent industry. For sure.
And regardless of what event you're putting up, it's almost unheard of to be able to put just one large tent up and not have some kind of back of the house tent, et cetera. And that's where these live.
Sure. And like we talked about earlier, is about ballasting these tents. Now that the world that we live in, I mean, so many tents are having to be put on temporary weights now that it's just a better option than certainly than a pole tent.
Oh, 100%.
So anything to add on this episode before we start to close it up?
No. Well, what's our next?
So we're going to have a guest for our next episode, and we're going to get into our topic is going to be kind of the dynamics of anchoring. Yep. So we've talked about pole tents and we've talked about frame tents. It's time to talk about how to hold them down.
Right.
It doesn't, we talked
to Pete about some anchoring, et cetera, but we're going to get into like the numbers.
No, we're going to get into some very specific.
It's going to be one that you really don't want to miss, because this is where our industry is going in terms of safety and properly anchoring your tents, et cetera. So the knowledge that you can gain from this next episode that we'll be releasing will be bar none.
Yep. So with that, we're going to sign out. You got anything else, Davis?
I'm good, man.
We're good. All right. We will talk to y'all in a couple weeks.
All right. Later, taters.